that comes up. Brilliant. So yeah, thank you for joining us. This webinar is part of the Escalate Business Support Programme, which is a 3-year programme through Oxlep that's funded by the ERDF that sadly finishes next month, but we've got some awesome events coming up over the next month that I'll share with you in the follow-up email. The support is for purposeful businesses, social enterprises and trading charities in Oxfordshire. Today we are joined by Vic Hancock-Vell, who is going to be talking through the grant funding process with us. So over to you, Vic.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me get some slides up so that you've got something to look at. It's lovely to meet you all, and thanks for having me, Rosie. My name's Vic. I've been working in the small charity sector specifically for about the last 15 years. So I came into the sector like many others do, as a total novice with a nice idea and a lot of enthusiasm, not necessarily a lot else. I was previously a secondary school teacher with a philosophy undergraduate degree, which has been both very helpful and useless in equal measure. But I really enjoyed my time doing that. So I've worked in smaller organizations, social good organizations for about 15 years, either as a volunteer, a co-founder, a trustee, in fundraising roles and senior leadership, and now specifically doing consultancy and training for all sizes of organizations, but especially focusing on smaller organizations working in the social good space. Fair Development is my social enterprise. I started that in 2016, and we donate 50% of our profits back into social good organizations through providing pro bono training and pro bono consultancy to super tiny organizations. If you want to stay connected with me, I've just put my details at the bottom there. I am pretty active on the internet, and so if you are as well, then do feel free to connect. Rosie, are you keeping an eye on the chat for anything that I might need to respond to?
Yes, I will do. And if anybody wants to put any questions as we go along in the chat, that would be great. And we'll have time at the end to go through a bit of a Q&A. So yeah, feel free to put any questions in the chat.
Thank you. Just want to make sure I'm not missing anything from people asking any questions. So the first thing that I always tell people to think about when we're starting to look at grant fundraising, whether you're a charity or a social enterprise, or whether you're trading, is not to dive straight in without first doing your groundwork and really getting those deep roots and strong foundations. So especially when you're starting out and the need for income is urgent, and it's tempting just to get straight into it. But I think you'll find that you're going against the grain, and it feels a little bit like you're sort of wading through treacle with each application if you haven't done some of this groundwork. So don't skip over these really important steps. And the first, I think, is really crucial, especially with socially purposed organizations or organizations that are working towards creating some sort of social good in the community or in the world, is to be really clear on what your North Star is. In simple terms, what's the point of this? Why am I here? Why are we doing what we're doing? What are we actually trying to achieve? And quite often you can feel pretty confident that you know what that is, and you feel that others in your organization might know what that is too. But what I see quite often happening is organizations not necessarily creating the time and space to come together and really make sure that they are all really on the same page and really aligned with what their North Star is. What is that thing that we are ultimately aiming for as this big social change that we're trying to achieve? And making sure that what that isn't something that we've just come up with, that it's not just our board of directors or our board of trustees or our founder and our sort of senior management group. It's not just us sitting in our kitchens saying, yes, this is the thing that we need to do. This is the thing that we need to change, that it's actually informed by what is needed and wanted by your community or the audience that is going to be receiving the thing that you're putting out there. And there are different ways of finding that out. How do we know that what we are putting out there and the activities that we are running, how do we know that it is actually needed and wanted by our community? And it could be through a needs assessment, it could be through consulting with people in your audience or in your community. Essentially, it's through conversations and asking the questions of the people who you intend your thing for, to make sure that you're heading in the right direction and that you're not just putting something out there because you think it's the right thing to do. So once you feel really confident that you know what you're aiming for and you believe that it's been informed by the people and the community that you exist for, we want to start doing our thing. We want to start testing it and piloting it and trialing some of our activities and projects. And we want to start gathering evidence straight away about whether it's working or not. This is something that in all kinds of fundraising is really important, but especially in grant fundraising, if you haven't got any evidence that it works, it's going to make it really hard for you to convince people to give you their money. So even if we haven't got a really big organization with lots of resources and we've got lots of ways of gathering evidence, we still need to think about an appropriate way for us to start proving our model. So in the beginning, when resources are really low, that could be simply some case studies of individual people, individual events, where you can start to paint a picture of how this person's life changed, how this person's life improved as a result of coming to our activity or receiving our program or using our service. And those can be really powerful ways of telling the story when you haven't got to the point of being able to have lots of data and surveys to send out. It is great eventually to start having some quantitative data, and grant funders in particular tend to love quantitative data. So in fundraising, case studies usually work really well when you're fundraising from a person, an individual, because usually we are emotional creatures and we respond with our heart, with our guts and our instincts. When you're approaching a grant fundraiser, usually they've got people to report to, they've got stakeholders, they need to be convinced with evidence that what you're doing works. And so they usually prefer to see quantitative data. And a nice mix of those two together can paint a really nice holistic picture of you saying, this is what we're trying to do, this is the evidence that we've got that people really want it and need it. Here's how we do it, and here's the evidence that we've got that it does actually work. And the final bit of groundwork is to be sort of set up behind the scenes. So to have your house in order. Have you got systems and processes and procedures and the right people to support grant writing? So that might be to be starting off with, it could be a simple spreadsheet where you're tracking who you're applying to, how much you've asked them for. You're maybe tracking your relationship with them so that you can say, okay, we applied in 2023, we didn't get it. We applied in 2024, we got it. And you're getting to see a timeline of your relationship with that funder. Have you got people around you in the organization who are able to support with grant fundraising? Have you got people who understand it? If you haven't and you're a registered charity, you might want to think about trying to bring in some expertise on your board of trustees. If you're a community interest company or a limited company, could you bring in some expertise into your board of directors? It's difficult going it alone. If you're trying to raise sort of significant amounts of money, it is hard to do on your own, especially when you're doing other things at the organization as well. Most of my experience is with smaller organizations where the person who's writing the grant applications is also the person who's writing the monitoring and evaluation reports. They're also doing the admin, they're doing the programs and activity scheduling. So it takes a team to be able to kind of really pull off successful fundraising from grants. So just think about who you've got around you in the organization And if you feel like you are lacking a bit in that support or that expertise, then think about ways of bringing that into your organization. And when you've got those solid foundations, you're getting towards being ready to start fundraising from grants. The final thing to think of is just make sure that you've kind of dotted the I's and crossed the T's in the background. So lots of funders will do due diligence on any organization that they fund. They'll be coming to look at your registration, wherever that is, whether it's on the Charity Commission or Companies House. If you've got any late overdue reports, that'll be a red flag for them. So make sure that you're getting you're getting your annual reports or company tax returns or anything like that. Make sure those are getting in on time. Make sure that you've got up-to-date information about who the directors or the trustees are. They might be coming to look at your website and your social media. Is there anything on there that might be a red flag for them? So just make sure that we are kind of ready behind the scenes. Quite often they'll ask for copies of your policies and procedures. If you're doing anything with vulnerable people or young people, make sure you've got your safeguarding or child protection policy. They might want to see an anti-money laundering policy. The Charity Commission website is a good resource to find out what kind of policies you need in place as a minimum if you're a registered charity. And it would be good to get all of those in place before you start embarking on grant fundraising. Otherwise, you might find yourself scuttling around in the background, coming up with them all when a particular funder might come asking for them. So there's a few stages to getting ready to do some grant fundraising. And the first place to begin is actually finding out who's going to give you this money. Where can I get this money from? And depending on what your legal structure is, so whether you're a registered charity, whether you're a community interest company or a social enterprise or a limited company, there are loads of places online that you can look for suitable funding. And I've linked some here and you'll be getting a copy of these slides afterwards, so you can follow these links. There are websites like Trust Fundraising, Funds Online, Grants Online. There's a website called School for Social Entrepreneurs, which is great, that has a funding database. The government website actually has some pretty good tips on where to find funding. And if you are a registered charity, then or a social enterprise, then your local infrastructure organization will have some guidance on where to find funding locally in particular. And if you're not sure who your local one is, then NAVCA are the national body for all of those. I'm sure Rosie can tell you who your local one is in Oxfordshire. So first of all, you need to find where you can find all these prospects. So get yourself onto these websites. Also look at websites of similar organizations to you and see whether they're name dropping any of their funders. If you're feeling brave, drop them an email and say, would you be happy to have a conversation and talk to us about where you've had some of your funding? What I've found is that a lot of the time smaller organizations are really great at sharing, and there's less of a scarcity mindset from smaller organizations about talking to each other about where funding comes from. So do identify who your peers are in your area and in your sector of work, and start to look at where they might be getting their funding from too. You can look at the Charity Commission website. You can look at annual reports of similar organisations to see whether they're listing any funders in there that might be suitable for your organisation as well. And you can use the Charity Commission advanced search for funders, and you can use the criteria to sort of come up with a bespoke list of funders who would be suitable for your particular type of work. There are great mailing lists that you can sign up to as well. So if you find funders that seem like a good fit for you, make sure you're signing up to their mailing lists to be the first to know when they're announcing new funds. Places like the School for Social Entrepreneurs and Grants Online, they have mailing lists as well. Sometimes I find that those mailing lists are easier than just kind of constantly pursuing that internet research, because it's kind of coming into your inbox in a digest email frequently, and it's usually it comes in deadline order. So those mailing lists can be really helpful. So by this point, you've probably got a lot of potential funders who you're thinking, okay, these places sound like the kind of place that might be able to give my organization some funding. Your next stage is to whittle it down and to qualify your prospects. So do you meet their criteria? And if you're not clear on whether you do, try to contact them somehow. Some funders are really great at being open, and they've got a phone number and an email address and they'll be responsive. Some funders try not to share a lot of that because perhaps they're a smaller family foundation and they don't have the capacity to answer phone calls or queries, or they've put all of the information on their website. And some go as far as saying, categorically, do not get in touch with us to ask any questions. So just make sure that you're reading what they've said on their website, reading what they've said on their charity commission or company's house listing about contacting them. This can be a really time-consuming part of sort of a grant application process, is actually qualifying your prospect list. If you happen to have any volunteer support around you, this is a really great thing to outsource to someone, because they don't have to know a lot about what your organization does to be able to do some of this initial desk research and qualifying of prospects. And what it is at this point is administrative and time consuming. So you might have several of these tabs open on your computer with all of these various funders, and you're going to need someone to go through and really carefully read the criteria and qualify whether your organization meets that criteria. And it can just be really time consuming. It's the sort of thing that I usually do when I'm sitting in front of the TV at night, and I just get my laptop out and do a bit of this research. But if you do have people around you at your organization who've got a few spare hours, it can be quite a nice, neat little package of help that they can provide, and an easy thing for you to be able to outsource to them. The final thing you want to do after you've got your qualified prospects is to somehow organize them. So I always think it's helpful to imagine that someone else has to come in and pick up where you've left off. You know, let's say that there is, there's been an emergency, or there's something that pulls you away from work. You need to be able to leave the organization and leave your kind of prospect pipeline in a way that someone else from the outside can come in and pick it up and make sense of it and understand it. You might choose to start off with just a spreadsheet. I am a big fan of a spreadsheet. I've tried to get my head around other systems, but I always revert back to my trusty spreadsheet, and so I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There are some really great customer relationship management tools that you can use. I know they're called customer relationship management tools, but they can also be used for donors and funders. And you can do all sorts of fancy things within those tools, having a profile for each funder, being able to log each interaction that you might have with a funder. It's possible to do a light touch version of that in a spreadsheet. And so if you haven't got the capacity or the budget to start exploring CRM systems, then I think a spreadsheet is a great place to start. I'm going to show you an example in a sec of what it could look like. But essentially what you need in your prospect research, in your pipeline, is you need the name of your funder, their website or their charity commission listing. So if somebody else comes in, they can click on the link and they can find the right funder, because sometimes they have very similar names. You want to include the value of the funding that's available from that funder, so that when you're scanning through your pipeline, you say, okay, I'm going to do a few small applications today. You might be able to sort your spreadsheet by all of your under £5,000 value grants, which are usually less complicated and a bit easier to do. So you know you can get a few of those out the door quite easily. So you don't have to, you could have your own categorizing for this. You could say over 5K, over 10,000, over 100,000, and you can group them in that way. But it just helps to give a sense of the amount of work that will be involved and what the potential value of the application might be. And then it's a good idea to have a column where you can write down which of your projects, which of your activities you think might be a good fit for this funder. So it might be that they're particularly interested in girls and women's work. It might be that they're particularly interested in supporting with core funding or pilot projects. And so write down in your prospect research document what you think you might approach them for. And again, this is helpful if you're bringing in somebody else into the organization. If you're bringing in any volunteers, any helping hands, then it's good to be able to give them that information in the spreadsheet. Crucially, a deadline. And so ideally, you'd be organizing this by quarter so that you can map out when you need to prioritize your time spent on these applications. Whether you've got any historical relationship with the funder or whether there's any connections to the funder in any way. Sometimes there might be a friend of a friend who knows someone who's a friend of a friend. And if so, how can you make the most of that relationship? And then your outcome when you get it. So successful, unsuccessful, do we try again? Do we not try again? And then what your next steps are. I'm not expecting you to read what's in these boxes, but it could end up looking something like this. So you could have your funder name, website, their thematic focus. So what do they focus on? Do they have a geographic focus? Are they looking at only organizations working in your area or all over the UK or globally? There's a couple of extra columns in here, like, is it single or is it multi-year? There's a column in here for what the application process is. So for example, is it send a letter to the address or is it submit online here? A timeline and some notes and so on. And so this is a kind of a bespoke one that we've added in. I've added in extra columns here for information that I want. But the items on the previous slide, and don't forget you'll get a copy of these so you don't need to worry about taking notes or writing them down. Those are the key things to include. There might be specific things that you would like to include as well that go beyond those criteria. But you do need some way of tracking your pipeline and being able to keep a log of when you've applied for them, whether it's been successful, and kind of how many people, how many prospects you've got in your pipeline coming up. It used to be that fundraisers would use a 1 in 6 or 7 success rate for grants, but these days it's more like 1 in 10 or 1 in 12. Grant fundraising is more competitive than it's ever been, combined with various other things that are making fundraising difficult for us at the moment. So my advice is to apply for 10 times the value that you need. So you need £10,000 for a project, you need to be applying for £100,000 worth of grants, assuming that you might get one of those. Sounds like a huge job, but there is a way of making that as efficient as possible, and we'll come on to that in a moment. So you've got your prospect list and you want to start making some relationships with some of these funders. How can you start to do that before, during, and after the application process or the funding period? So before you apply, you can phone. Unless they're one of these funders who says categorically do not get in touch with us, if there's a phone number, I always think it's worth ringing them. Even if you have to make up a question that you want to ask them, it gives you a real advantage to get on the phone with someone, let them hear your voice, ask some questions, and just try to get a little bit of insight that might put you at an advantage. This has worked really well for me in the past, where I rang up a funder and said, I'm thinking of applying for this. Does it sound like something you'd be interested in? And they said, no, not really, but tell me a bit more about your work. And then they ended up giving me an idea of something else to apply for, which we then ended up getting. And it was the beginning of a really great relationship with that funder, who then funded us year on year. And it wouldn't have happened had I just submitted that idea that I had at the beginning. a quiet word from the right trustee or a funding officer who's in charge of the grants might increase your chances of success with an application. There's a great blog that I've linked here from a lovely man called Mike at Lime Green Consulting, who's got some really great tips on this. So rather than go through all of those, I've just linked that blog for you there that you can take a read of if you would like. If you're unsuccessful, ask for feedback if the opportunity is there. So quite often they don't provide feedback because they're completely oversubscribed and they don't have the capacity. But if there's an opportunity to ask for some feedback, it's always worth finding out what it was about the application that meant it was a no. And sometimes you might hear the very hard thing, which was actually the application was great, we just didn't have enough money this time, which can be really challenging to hear, but also heartening that it wasn't anything to do with the quality of your application. And ask about when you can reapply. Some funders have windows of reapplication where you can't reapply within 12 months or 24 months. Some say that you can apply immediately after an unsuccessful application. During the funding period, make sure to keep them regularly updated. Maybe ask for a call to let them know how it's going. Send a thank you note. You know, funders are people too, and they value relationship building. And you know, it's not to say that sending a thank you card is going to secure you that 5-year core cost grant, but looking after relationships and managing those relationships well, hopefully will give you that advantage when they're considering applications in future. Try to get to know the decision makers at the organizations if you can. Invest some time in getting to know them and building relationships with them. And if it's a local funder, you know, see if you can get a cup of coffee or a cup of tea with them in person. After the funding period, again, keep thanking them and ask them when you can reapply. And if it's possible, ask them to have a little chat on what your reapplication might look like. There might be some guidance that they can give you on what a sensible reapplication might look like. They might have some feedback from your last report to them, for example. And when you're reapplying, take on board any of that feedback from the last application, from the last report, and see if you can make it personal. You know, a really simple thing that I like to do on my cover letters for grants is to go onto the Companies House listing or the Charity Commission listing for the funder, get the names of the trustees and write the letter to the names of the trustees. So not just dear the trustees of the X Foundation, but dear Maria, Rosa, Fred, and Akeem. You know, these are real people who are running a real organization. Their names are out there in the public domain. And if it was me, it would make me feel like that person had gone that little bit of an extra mile to acknowledge my name and write that letter to me personally. So on then to grant writing. So you've got your pipeline of funders, they're qualified and you know that you do meet their criteria. You've double checked with them, you've done a little bit of pre-application relationship building to make sure that when that application lands in their inbox or on their doormat, that they're going to be saying, oh yes, I recognize this name. And you know that you're going to submit an application that is going to be considered by them because you meet their criteria. So how do we actually write a great application? So usually if you're a social good organization, so a charity or a social enterprise, you will want to have something called a case for support. This is basically a sort of standard pack of information that explains to an external person, so a donor or a funder, who you are, why you exist, why what you're doing is great and why they should give you their money. Usually you would have one for each discrete project that you did. It's great to have an organizational level one as well to give an overview of the organization's work. But if you're doing lots of different things, you might find that you need a case for support document for each of your different things that you're doing. You might want to include things like the need for your work, so the market for your activity. And like I mentioned at the beginning, ideally this would be informed by real conversations with the people who need and want what you're offering. And you'd be able to use that then in your case for support to say, we've spoken to the people in our community, we've spoken to the people in our potential audience, and they've told us that this is the problem that they have, and this is something that they need. And that's much more powerful than saying, this is what we do, we've always done it like that, we've just decided that this is what's happening. So you're setting the scene for, why do you need to exist? Why is your thing that you're doing needed? And then you're answering that need with your solution. So what is it that you do that responds to this need that you've laid out in this case for support? And what's your impact? So your solution, what difference is it making? What makes you the best organization to do this? So when we're smaller, we can't necessarily claim that we are having, this really transformational impact over lots of different geographical areas. And so what makes you the best organization to do your specific thing in your specific location? Really try to think about what makes you stand out and why you're uniquely placed to solve this very particular problem. In your case for support, you can use desk research. So if you're not sure exactly how to frame the need for your work, if you haven't had a chance to have conversations with local people in the community, you can use desk research. So you can get some basic information that's available online about poverty statistics, for example, in your area, or about environmental statistics for the thing that you're providing. You can set the scene using that desk research that already exists out there, and you can include some of your own community consultation and needs assessment as well. Make sure to use lots of photos. If you've got case studies, as we mentioned earlier, to really personalize it and bring home for the reader that this is something that affects people. How can you kind of make that connection with someone who knows nothing about your work, who doesn't have that emotional connection to the work, perhaps like you do? How can you create that feeling for them? And case studies are a great way of doing that. Use your own research as well to build that strong case. So anything that you're doing internally, whether it's a conversation that you've had with someone that you want to include, whether it's some of your own research that you've started to do through surveys, perhaps, you need to be building a really strong case in this document that that it's needed, that your solution is wanted, and that your solution works. Like a job application, it's important to tailor your applications. So it's unlikely that you're going to use this case for support as a copy and paste and send out to a funder as it stands. You're more likely going to use it as a crib sheet. You might send it in its entirety, exactly as it is, to certain funders who say, we don't have a certain grant application process, just send us 2 sides of A4. But most of the time, you're going to be going in and tweaking it to make it really bespoke to the funder that you're applying to. So for example, let's say the funder talks about being really interested in a particular activity. You're going to find a way of really pulling out how you do that particular activity in your application document. But having your case for support means that when you go to start a new application, you don't have to start from scratch each time. You've got the skeleton and already a little bit of the flesh on the skeleton to start doing a really solid grant application. And it's a really good idea to get someone totally unconnected to read it, because if they don't get it, and if they're saying, what does that acronym mean, or I don't understand that, then it's very likely that your funder isn't going to understand it either. So it's a really good idea to get someone to have a little scan of your case for support and just make sure that it reads well and that it makes sense. Some things to think about when you're writing your grants. So both in your case for support document and also in any other kind of grant writing that you might do where you're not perhaps using your case for support. Some of these top tips to have in your mind. So don't tell them what you do, tell them what difference it makes. I saw someone describe this as, I don't want to know how busy you are. I want to know what difference you're making in people's lives. And I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about it, because what I see a lot in doing grant assessing, so I do a bit of grant assessing for a funder, and what I see a lot in the applications is people telling me how busy they are. We've run X number of training sessions. We've delivered X bags of this or that. And that gives me a sense of the volume of stuff that's happening, but it doesn't actually tell me what happens to that person after they've received the training. It doesn't tell me what happens to that person after they've received the bag of the care package. And that, as a funder, is what we're interested in. It gives us, it's interesting to know how busy you are and the scale of what you're doing, but ultimately we want to know what change is occurring in a person or in a community as a result of the stuff that you're doing. So really make sure that you're talking about what difference it makes, not just what you do. And don't forget the people you exist for. Don't forget to make them present in your applications. Quite often we can become quite detached from the people and the communities that we exist for in our applications, and their voice is lost. And so how can you bring their voices into your applications? Could you start with a really powerful quote from one of the people who's benefited from your service, who's enjoyed your service? Can you include a picture or a case study? How can we make sure that their voices are represented? Is there anything that you can do to stand out or create a bit of a wow moment? 95% of the applications I read start with the same sentence. Can anyone guess what the same format, this sentence of the beginning of every grant application document?
We need your money.
That's usually the last sentence for sure. Yes, we need your money. And the start of the applications almost always start with charity name was founded in location to do X. And I can't tell you, after reading hundreds of those types of opening sentences, your brain starts to switch off. So how can we stand out with a bit of a wow moment? Let's not start our applications with charity name was founded in 1970, yada, yada. I've already switched off. How can we create that wow moment? Maybe you've got a really beautiful quote from somebody who's used your service or enjoyed your product or done something with you. And could you start with that sentence? And then as a reader, I'm already thinking, oh, wow, not only is this a bit different, I'm really intrigued now because this is the voice of the person who this money is going to benefit. Don't assume anything. No acronyms or sector lingo. It's very likely that your funder will not be an expert in what you're doing. So don't try and sound really kind of important and professional. You're trying to convince your everyday Joe off the street to give you money. So you need to describe the work that you're doing in a way that makes sense to them. Unless you're applying to a funder that is a sort of expert funder in your sector of work where you need to impress them with that. A lot of funders are small family foundations, or they're not necessarily experts in every type of work. So just make sure that you're using language that people understand. And get organized. So again, just going back to that point at the beginning, are you ready for any due diligence that might be required? Have you got any supporting documents that you might be asked for, like your strategy or your business plan or any of your policies and procedures? And finally, my advice is try not to become a shapeshifter. Don't reinvent yourself over and over again just to fit into what the funder's saying they'll give you some money for. What I see happening a lot is organizations not feeling confident enough in what they're doing and therefore coming up with a new concept every time they see a pot of funding that's available. So they find a pot of funding and it's available for X type of projects. Okay, we could probably do an X type of project. Let's think about how we might be able to do that. We're kind of designing a whole new project or activity with this funder in mind. And then that happens again and again. And when you've then got 4 or 5 or 6 funded grant kind of activities going at any one time, you suddenly have lots of different things to manage, lots of different funders to report to, lots of different activities, and people's perhaps salaries aligned only with a grant. And when that grant's over, that person's role is gone. My advice is to decide what you're going to do as an organization and find money for that thing. Try not to be too tempted by going over here and finding that shiny thing and thinking, well, we'll give that a go because it's money. There is a lot of money out there, and there will be money for what you do specifically. So be really confident in what you're doing. Stick to what you're doing, do it well, get the evidence for what you do, and ask for money for it. Try not to become that shapeshifter. And I think it will make your life less stressful and hopefully make your work more sustainable as well, because you'll be less relying on that kind of grant to grant living. Okay, so finally, before we come on to some questions, a note on full cost recovery. It's a handy little graphic here of a cake, not to make you too hungry as we're going over lunchtime. But full cost recovery basically means that you're ensuring that your organization is not out of pocket for delivering an activity. So what we quite often see is that you've got £10,000 to deliver a project, but it's going to cost you as a charity £2,000 of your own core costs to deliver that project. And what we want to see happening is that the funder gives you the money for the £10,000 worth of the activity and the £2,000 worth of your core costs. And we need to be asking them for that. So the first step in that is to know what your costs are. So you might not have any paid staff at the minute, but if you want to have paid staff, you need to start writing down how much of their time they might be spending on certain activities. And if they were to be getting a salary or being paid for this, how much would they be getting? How much of your overhead costs are relating to a particular activity? Is there room hire? Is there travel costs? Are there heating costs? All of these need to be factored into your grant applications, because if not, you're going to be left in what some people call the non-profit starvation cycle, which is where you've got tons of money for projects, but behind the scenes, the organization's crumbling because there aren't those core costs there to keep it sustained. So anticipate what you think your core costs are going to be. Anticipate what you think your staff costs would look like if you were in your best case scenario and you had a project officer and a fundraiser and a project manager, and fundraise based on those numbers. Don't fundraise based on what it's costing you right now if you know that really you would love to have a salaried role on this, or you'd like to be spending twice as much as you're currently spending. Kind of anticipate that best case scenario and fundraise through grants based on that best case scenario, and make sure that you're recovering all of those costs in your project budgets. And quite often it's about how you cut the cake and how you present it to funders. If you put a line in your budget that says contribution to overhead costs, they might turn their nose up a bit and say, well, that doesn't sound like something we'd be interested in. But if you've threaded those costs throughout your project budget lines, like, for example, contribution towards the cost of monitoring and evaluation, that's your salary. Contribution towards project management costs, that's your salary. Contribution towards the delivery of the training sessions, that's your petrol costs, your train travel, your volunteer expenses, your room hire. Often what we think are overheads are actually project costs. So just make sure that you're really looking at how much it costs you to deliver the project or the activity. Anything associated with doing that is a project cost. if you can't get the full cost from funders, you have to make a decision about whether you really want to go for that activity. You know, if you found if you've got an activity and you've found a funder who'll give you £10,000 for it, but you know you're going to have to come up with £2,000 worth of overhead costs or core costs, it's then for you as an organisation to say, are we going to go for that, knowing that we have to find this money from somewhere else? And just make sure that you have a balance in your portfolio of grants of funders who fund in that way of being quite strict on only having those direct project costs, and those who are willing to contribute to some of the true cost of your charity's kind of activities, or your organisation's activities. Okay, I can see the chat has been pinging away and we've got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take any questions that anyone might have.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Vic. That was really, really great, and some fantastic examples. So thank you for that. If anybody's got any questions, I think there's been lots of information sharing and people talking about their businesses in the chat. But if you've got any questions, feel free to either put your hand up or pop it in the chat. Either is fine. Grant.
Yeah, hi Vic, nice to meet you. That really was brilliant, honestly, and I can see the value of being able to share this video with people coming forward. I suppose, and I'm sorry I missed the very beginning of it, so I'm sorry if you've covered it, but this fundamental question, really interesting to hear you talking about core costs there, but the way in which you can thread it through applications. But so many organisations we're supporting just want funding for core costs, and that's that classic one. I mean, you've got, it's probably an unfair question, but have you got any tips about that really? Or could it be that they can perhaps try and disguise it in a different way? Or are there any sort of sources that are more keen to cover just that basic, we need to cover our running costs?
Yeah, I mean, it's the $1 million question that every single organisation is asking at the minute, is how can we cover our core costs? And quite honestly, my advice would be, do not rely on grants for your core costs. I see a lot of organisations kind of feeling really stuck because they can't find funders to fund their core costs. But I think what we forget about is all the other types of income that we could be bringing into our organisation. And my advice, particularly for smaller organisations, would be to make sure that you're looking at other ways of bringing in unrestricted income to cover your core costs. So namely fundraising from individuals. So individual regular giving, those £5, £10, £15 a month, campaigns or appeals throughout the year, major donors or corporates. I think we can get really tempted to get sucked into grants and just get really obsessed with, grant applications. But I would personally never rely on grant applications for keeping my core costs coming in. I would always be looking at unrestricted income through individuals and that sort of thing. And then, as you said, disguise as many of your core costs. And it's not even really disguising it, because I think quite often we ourselves kind of incorrectly categorize our project costs as core costs, because we see it as, a salary, and therefore that's got to be an overhead. But if a person's salary, if that person is the person who's delivering the activity, then it's a project cost. So I think you're right to say that it's partly looking at making sure that you're recovering as many of those core costs as possible through grants, but it's definitely also not just relying on grants for your core costs. And there are a handful of funders who specifically fund core, but they are hugely oversubscribed. And so I don't think it's sensible to rely on that too much. Thanks for your question.
Brilliant, thank you. I suppose related to that, so David's asked in the chat, thoughts on blending business-related income and charitable grants, which I suppose you've covered a bit, but more, I suppose it's more focusing on trading charities as well, so kind of individual donors, but also having some sort of trading element to what you do.
Yeah, I mean, David, do you want to elaborate any on your question before I answer, just so that I can understand what you're asking fully?
I don't know. My experience is that charities are not terribly good are often not very businesslike. They don't understand that social enterprise is not just a tap of income you can turn on. You've got to invest in it for N years before you're going to get anything out of it. But likewise, that a lot of the grant funders, well, the language is often you're either charitable or you're a business, even if it's a social business. And very often you've got a blend of the two, because you're working with a poor community who doesn't, you're not going to have a viable commercial business. So you're going to subsidize. So the language gets complicated and messy and the rest of it. So it was just, whether that was just my experience, some of which is from Malawi rather than from Oxfordshire, but I was just wondering whether you'd come across, seen any, is there any movement on that? Are sort of grant makers learning and progressing on that front, or are they still stuck in that dichotomy?
I think there's definitely been a bit of movement in terms of the type of legal structures that grant makers will consider. And I think we're sort of seeing that with grant makers being more open to funding social enterprises in their various legal structures and community interest companies. And there is a little bit of funding available for kind of, you know, socially purposed organizations trading as limited companies. So in terms of grant funding, I think there has been movement on that. In terms of kind of blending different types of income, you know, I would never rely on grants as my sole source of income, no matter what I was doing as my kind of trading or of my activities. And I think we see that a lot actually in the sector, is like a real heavy over reliance on grant income. And some organizations to sort of like, you know, 90 or 95% of their income comes from grants. And so, you know, that's really risky, because if we see that go, then we're really quite snookered. So I would definitely be looking as well at kind of, as well as what I was saying in response to Grant's question about looking at individual type of income streams for core costs. But yeah, as you've said, David, other types of income that we could bring into the organization as well. So if you are trading, and then using kind of trading income to make sure that you're contributing towards a percentage of your core cost, and that you're using that for organizational growth. You know, really what we want in unrestricted income for is for organizational development and organizational growth. There might be grants that are specifically for funding organizational development. They might be funders out there who are interested in giving you a grant of money to implement a new system or a new process. But it's much easier for us as organizations if we can just use our own unrestricted income to invest in that sort of thing. And so whether that's income that's coming in through trading or through individuals, I think just there has to be that mix of unrestricted and restricted. And if we get too sucked into all of our income being from grants and therefore being restricted, as you said, it's going to really stop us from ever really investing in the foundations and in the behind the scenes mechanisms. And so we'll just be delivering programs year on year, but we'll not be growing as an organization kind of behind the scenes. Is that helpful? I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Yep.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, I think that's really, really useful. And I think that's a brilliant bit of advice as well, to kind of be thinking about other streams of income. And actually for any type of organization, you know, thinking about your trading, thinking about other pots. And I think just all of what, you know, what you said in this last hour is really useful to purposeful businesses, social enterprises and charities, because it's all about thinking about your business plan essentially, and thinking about your impact and what you want to achieve. So brilliant. Grant, again.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time, so it'll be a quickie. And it's actually a bit cheeky, really, because it's not a question. It's just more really sharing experience. I think one of the things that I've, over the years, have been involved with sort of with supporting charities, but also connecting them with businesses is, you know, I think one of the things that charities really need to understand, and social enterprises, is the value that they have to offer. You know, rather than going to businesses, if we're talking about developing relationships with corporates, so often they'll go there asking for something, but I don't think there's a lot of charities that don't understand the value of what they've got to offer, that actually would be beneficial for businesses to collaborate with, and that will ultimately lead to some sort of funding or income generation, really. So it's just really sharing that. I think if charities look in at themselves and understand what it is they've got to offer, they're in a much stronger position, I think.
Yeah, I think that's so right. And we underestimate what we've got to offer to people who have the money to give it to us. And I think seeing it as a more equal partnership and truly believing that you've got something to offer them too, is a really great way to go into conversations about that. And if we put on our corporate fundraising hat in particular, is really looking about how we can be as sort of socially driven, socially purposed organizations, but how we can approach those sorts of people, those sorts of funders, and say, we can help you meet your ESG targets. ESG is, replaced CSR as the thing that all these corporates need to be ticking off. And we have the potential to be able to go in and say, we can help you with that, but it's going to cost you. You need to give us a big check. Thanks, Grant.
Brilliant. David?
Well, I'll just add to that absolutely that approach for businesses, but actually my experience is that approach for trusts and other grant makers, because they're also, you're going to provide them with a way of realizing their mission. And it is an exchange. You're providing them outputs, numbers they can stick in their annual report, good case stories. They want to be able to say, well, we supported this organization to do X. So I was with an organization that had a real victim culture and was sort of out with the hands begging. And it was, I knew, because I'd been on the other side before, being begged, and it was bloody annoying. People coming to you saying, I can help solve your problem, as in produce outputs for you, whether you're a business or a grant maker. So I'm endorsing what you're saying, but I'm saying do it for everybody as an exchange, not as a begging.
That's a great way to frame it in your case for support document is, how exciting it would be to read a document that was like, look at this amazing opportunity you've got to have some real social impact. And I love that framing. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. So I will send a follow-up email with Vic's slides, so you've got them, and also some information about the last events on the Escalate programme, and some of the useful links that have been shared in the chat as well as we've been going on today. So if you've got any questions, you'll have my email, so you can come back to me, and I can either forward on to Vic or hopefully signpost you to the right place. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Vic. Really, really fab presentation. So brilliant. Have a good afternoon. See you soon.
Keep in touch, everyone. Good to see you.
Really good.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye.